You and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre Viskontas. This is a podcast that explores the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. In the wake of the devastating fires in Los Angeles, where so many people have lost their lives and so many more have lost all of their worldly possessions, the question of how we can be happy seems almost trite. Even many of us who are not directly affected are questioning our purpose in life and our legacy, empathizing with residents of the Pacific Palisades or Altadena or any of the other cities where people have just lost everything. So I thought it might be a good time to turn to Jordan Grumet. He's a hospice and palliative care physician who has spent many hours at the bedsides of people who are dying and has thought deeply about personal loss and what living a meaningful life means. And he has a timely book that's just come out. It's called The Purpose Code: How to Unlock Meaning, Maximize Happiness, and Leave a Lasting Legacy. So that seems like a good place to start. Jordan Grumet, welcome to Inquiring Minds.
Thank you so much for having me.
So how have these fires and the devastation that you've, I'm sure, heard about and thought about deeply, how has this changed what you think about in terms of a person's legacy?
Interestingly enough, I've been thinking about this a lot after the elections, right? So for half the country, they felt triumphant after this election, this presidential election, and the other half were devastated. And so for many people right now, we're questioning, what does it feel like to live in this new world where everything has changed? And I think this tragedy in Los Angeles right now is also reflective of that same idea. When the world changes rapidly and all of a sudden you're stuck in a situation you didn't expect, how do we move forward? And so I've been thinking a lot about purpose as a bulwark. A lot of times we think that when life gets stressful, we don't have time for purpose and we push it aside. But I actually think of it as a last line of defense. When all the things outside of you are changing, things you have no agency or control over, no matter how hard you tried, if your candidate didn't win, they didn't win. No matter how hard you tried to be safe and protect yourself, if you are in one of those areas where the fire is causing excessive damage, you can't do anything about that. So you don't have agency. And when we don't have agency, we tend to feel horrible. And so I think purpose is a great bulwark because we can have agency over that. It can be a last line of defense where we can start thinking about what can we build upon that lights us up, that connects us to other people. Because ultimately, as you were saying in your introduction, we're really looking for some semblance of happiness, feeling okay. And it can be very difficult to feel that way when life is changing so rapidly and we're dealing with tragedy. On the other hand, it still holds true. Happiness is connected to things like purpose and very much to interpersonal connections. And we can have those even in the worst of situations. And so for those people struggling right now, I want to send them a lifeline and say all these things you have no control over feel exhausting and painful, but there is still something you do have control over, which is your sense of purpose and your connection with other people. And that can be a bulwark. It can protect you against all these other things you have no control over.
So I also want to ask you about the difference between purpose and passion, because I think sometimes, at least in my life, they get conflated. And when we think about the legacy and what we choose to do with our time, a lot of us think or given the advice that, oh, just follow your passion. And, for a lot of us, that actually doesn't end up being the path to happiness or contentment or even connection. So how do you think about what purpose is versus what sort of passion is and how those two might drive people differently?
I think a big problem with passion is not that we conflate it with purpose. We conflate it actually with what I call big P purpose. So In the book, I talk a lot about the difference between big P purpose, which I think is very much associated with anxiety, and little p purpose, which is more associated with the health, happiness, and longevity that a lot of the scientific studies show are associated with a sense of purpose in life. So what do I mean by big P purpose and little p purpose? Big P purpose is big, audacious purpose. In America, we say, if you can think it, you can build it. And so we love to create a big version of purpose, whether that's becoming a billionaire or curing cancer or, traveling to the moon or becoming president. We like to go after these big, audacious goals that often we don't have agency or control over, right? You have to be the right person at the right time, saying the right things with a heck of a lot of luck and good genetics to become president or to become a billionaire. So most of us are not going to get there, and it's going to leave us frustrated. Little p purpose is much more process associated. So big P purpose is all about the big audacious goal. Little p purpose is all about process and finding things that light you up. So you could say, wow, little p purpose sounds a lot like passion, right? Things that light us up sounds a lot like passion. But the difference is we often start thinking about big audacious purpose when we speak about passion. So it's not just doing something that lights me up, it's doing something that lights me up, that causes a big change in the world, that gets something majorly done, that I get recognition for, something really hard and difficult. And so of course, if you tell people to follow their passion and their passion ends up being very much big audacious purpose, they're going to feel frustrated because it's incredibly hard to, you know, change your life in such a way that you're spending all your time going after these big audacious goals that often don't fill you up while you're in the process of trying to get there, because a lot of times you're frustrated and really sometimes even doing things you don't like to do to service these goals. And a lot of times you don't even make it to that goal. So what I often tell people is follow your little p purpose as opposed to your passion. So find the things that light you up. That doesn't mean you have to quit your job. It doesn't mean you have to change your whole life. But what it means is that we want to continuously be looking at our schedule, and we want to be doing more things that light us up over time and less things we loathe. So it's very normal for people to have jobs that they don't love, but they're good at it and they make money. I don't say, hey, drop that job and follow your passion. That's just not realistic. People need an income, and there's something they're good at, they're trained to do. But what I do say is start developing little p purpose in other parts of your life. And when possible, incrementally also bring that into your job, something that's very manageable. We're not talking about going from no purpose to a life full of purpose and passion in a day or a week or a month. We're talking about thinking about a career and building more purpose in your life, and also building maybe a career that incrementally brings in these things you're passionate about. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who was in corporate America, and she didn't love her job. And so if I said, follow your passion, you should leave that job, she would leave her very high paying job and she wouldn't know what to do with herself. And she'd have the big audacious goal of not only being really passionate about what she does, but also finding a revenue stream that she could get through that passion. Instead, what she did is she started asking herself, what really lights me up? And she actually was really excited about this idea of women's role in corporate America. And so she started a blog about that, something simple she did on weekends. She spent a few hours a week. That was just that. She did that for about 6 months. She found it really lit her up. And so she started doing programs for her work in her corporate job. She did that for another 6 months, and people started to notice. And one day her boss came to her and said, you know what? I think we want to cut you to 50% time so that you can then start teaching these programs. So what happened is she brought in a little p purpose in her life. Even if nothing changed at work, she already added in these purposeful hours. But then eventually she was able to subtract out a little bit of what she didn't like at work because she didn't love her job, but her boss saw the value in what she was doing. And all of a sudden she was only working 50% of the time at something she didn't like as much. And she had replaced it with 50% extra time of things she loves. And so that's how I think we need to look at it. If we start looking at passion as big P purpose, I think it's going to frustrate us.
I love this illustration in your book where you have like the big P and it's like a boulder that's just like flattening the person. And then you've got little P where it's like a bowl of, cherries. I like to think of them as cherries. And you can pick one up and you can digest it and it can feed you.
Listen, we fundamentally get purpose wrong. We think it is this one thing that's going to make our life happy. And we either find it and live the best life ever, or we miss it and we're miserable. And that kind of all or nothing thinking really sets us up to feel miserable. Mm-hmm. A lot of people come to me and say, I have no idea what my purpose is. I can't find my purpose. And they look at me and they say, stop telling me to find my purpose. And I think the reason why is we've set it up as a really high stakes phenomena that most people feel they can't win.
I think it was reminding me of some of Carol Dweck's work on growth and fixed mindset, where in growth mindset you set learning goals that you have agency over, whereas in a fixed mindset you set achievement goals where a lot of it is out of your control, winning that competition, making $1 million, being famous, etc. And so, I wondered how you think about the growth and fixed mindsets as a way of helping people tangibly figure out whether they're after the big P or the little p.
Yeah, and I think Carol Dweck talks a lot about kind of the abundance mindset versus the scarcity mindset. And it's funny because if you listen to the influencers out there, right, and they have this notion of killing it, right? So what's killing it? Killing it is making these really big, audacious goals and then going after them. But what they don't realize is that's actually very scarcity mindset oriented. It's very all or nothing, winner takes all, and only a few succeed. And so, what we're really looking for is abundance. And so, what could be more abundant than finding the little things that light you up and doing more of them? For any of us, there could be millions of things that light us up. And the thing about it is, it doesn't take anything away from anyone when we find what version of purpose lights us up and goes after it. And so, I think the big P purpose, I think the scarcity mindset, I think the fixed mindset are all connected.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
the growth mindset, again, is more about what we have agency over and what are the things we can enjoy the process of doing regardless of the goal. Because again, once we get kind of goal oriented, we are fixed. We're honed into either reaching that goal or not reaching that goal. And it becomes the central drive in what we're doing. And often that actually leads us to do things we don't really love. Like I love podcasting and I love the big audacious goal of having 1 million downloads a month. But once I start doing things like TikTok videos and Instagram, which I don't love at all, once I start doing those things to drive people to my podcast because I'm so enthralled with this goal that I'm willing to spend my time doing things I don't enjoy the process of doing, I've kind of lost the thread.
Mm-hmm. I resonate so deeply with that because that's been something that I've struggled with for a decade of being a podcaster. That is not, for me, podcasting is a medium which started out as, having these intimate conversations that people feel like they're kind of overhearing. They're sitting with you at the dining room table while you're having a conversation, and that's really appealing to me. And so yes, like all these other trappings seem to really take away from the thing that drew me personally to podcasting. I'm not saying that there isn't, obviously there's great podcasts out there that don't follow that model, but it also then makes me think about framing and how I think a lot of what you've been talking about in the book, a lot of times I think probably in hospice settings when people are, there are many different experiences that people can have end of life. But I was really touched by Atul Gawande's, book about how like having these conversations before you're in that situation is really important because there's a whole bunch of, emotions that are happening. So can you talk to us about framing and what advice you might give people who might say, well, I don't know what lights me up, or, I don't, if I look back, there can be kind of looking back on life as a whole and think, well, I never reached my potential, or elements like that. Whereas, so that's a convoluted, very bad podcasting question, but I'm going to throw it at you.
Well, so I think the framing is this. The reason why people get so upset about purpose is they feel they can't find it. And I try to make the cogent argument that we shouldn't find purpose, we should build or create it. But then people still come back at me and say, well, what do I build or create purpose around? And what I call those are purpose anchors. Those are inklings, beckonings, things that light us up. So yes, I guess it's possible you could be a person who has no idea what lights you up, but there are many ways you can go about trying to figure that out. One is the framing of the dying, right? So I love to say, let's put us in the frame of someone who's just been given a terminal illness and ask them what they really regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do. We're really asking them about regrets. Regrets are a great version of a purpose anchor. In the dying, it's not very fun, right? Because they don't have agency, they don't have energy or time, they can't really change things. But you and I, who hopefully are not on our deathbeds, we actually have some agency to take that regret, flip it around, and turn it into a purpose anchor. I'm a perfect example. If I had died 10 years ago, I would have deeply regretted that I never traditionally published a book. It was something I always knew I wanted to do, but I always had excuses why I couldn't do it. But when I started framing it that way, all of a sudden it became really obvious to me I needed to start building a life around that. I needed to start pursuing traditional publishing. And so I did. So that's one really easy frame to use. Another one is to realize that children understand purpose much better than adults do. So if you look at kids, especially when they're really young and especially before they get into electronics and stuff, you give them a day free of school and they will go out and play. They'll build forts, they'll play basketball, they'll get on their bikes and ride all day long. That's a perfect version of little P purpose. Usually they don't have any major goal except to have fun. And a lot of times they'll even forget the time and come home late for dinner. They'll get into that kind of flow state.
Mm-hmm.
So another frame is that of the joys of childhood. Like, what did your bedroom look like? What were the pictures? What were the trophies? What were the drawings? Those could be purpose anchors. A lot of times we abandon them when we get older and think we have to do important things like go to school and get careers. But a lot of times those joys of childhood really could still be meaningful to us now. For me, it was collecting baseball cards. Even now, I stopped collecting baseball cards when I was a little kid, but even now, if I'm on Facebook and I see something about baseball or baseball cards, it lights my brain up. So if I'm ever looking for purpose anchors, I could get deeply back involved in that world. Those are two really easy ways. I also talk about the art of subtraction. So a lot of people see their jobs as something they don't love or enjoy. And so again, let's reverse the frame on that and say, stop thinking about what you don't like at work. Let's write out all your roles and responsibilities. Scratch out everything you loathe. Is there anything of the 12 or 15 things you do regularly? Is there any one or two of them that light you up? And if so, can we start building some purpose around that? Again, I'm a perfect example. I was a practicing doctor for like 15 years and it was exhausting me and burning me out. When I started subtracting out everything I didn't like, I realized I still loved hospice work. I would do it even if no one was paying me for it. So I used the art of subtraction to find a purpose anchor, and then I could start bringing more of that into my life. And last but not least, if you still can't figure out any purpose anchors with all of this, you use the spaghetti method. You throw a bunch of things against the wall and see what sticks. So you do things you normally don't do, hang out with people you normally don't hang out with, see if any of those light you up. And so there is definitely a mindset shift, again, away from the scarcity of my purpose has to be something big and life-changing and deeply quote unquote meaningful, and really changing that frame to, well, what do I kind of like doing and how do I bring more of that into my life?
Do you worry about, now you mentioned electronics and how you need to capture children before the advent of electronics in their lives? And, of course, there's a lot of evidence that child or adult alike, if you spend a lot of time on screens, especially in certain ways, that sort of diminishes some of the other elements of your life. And I see that a lot in kids too, who all of a sudden, they get such a rush out of, say, playing
Yeah.
video games that then it's
Yeah.
really hard to convince them to go and like pick up some sticks and play in the yard. Do you see a generational shift in that way in terms of the little P purpose and how rewarding those little P light you up moments are going to be, and how that relates to meaningful lives?
So I think social media and technology have changed things drastically and have led to a huge amount of purpose anxiety, right? This idea that
Mhm.
finding our purpose or living up to a purpose makes us frustrated and anxious. I think it deeply adds to it. Not in the way you first mentioned, though. I don't think it's the kids who love playing the video games. In fact, I know plenty of adults who are now computer programmers that was the road that brought them to computer programming because
Mm.
that lit them up, and then they started messing around with the computer games themselves, and then they became programmers, etc. So if that
Hmm.
deeply lights you up, there's some really good things about that. A bunch of surgeons actually were gamers, right? Because their hands got really adept at doing things. So I have no problem with that, but I do have a problem with what social media is doing with us, because there is a purpose vacuum, right? People have no idea what purpose should look like in their life. They have this idea that it has to be big and audacious. And since that's scary and they don't have an answer for how they're going to change the world, they start looking to social media to give them an idea of what purpose could be. And they often co opt other people's version of purpose. And let me tell you, if you spend a whole day on TikTok or Instagram, you're going to think purpose looks like six pack abs, wearing the nicest clothes, traveling the world, and having a 7-figure business. And again, this is big, audacious purpose that most of us don't have agency to actually achieve. And more importantly, the people selling this to us are people who don't really care about us or our sense of purpose. They want us to co-opt this version of purpose so that we buy their thing or we follow them. It's the same with marketing and advertising. Back in the day, it was TV commercials, right? Now it's social media. And to a lesser extent, it's society in general. And this idea, like our parents, a lot of times they want us to co-opt their version of purpose because they think about all the mistakes they made. And so they're trying to get us not to make the same mistakes. What are you going to do when you get older? You're going to be a doctor. You're going to be a lawyer. That's kind of all society's versions of what we should do. And it's really pushing us to do these more big, audacious things that don't necessarily light us up. And so I think social media has stepped in where there was a purpose vacuum already and created a very harmful version of purpose that a lot of people are feeling bad about. No wonder people are like, stop telling me to find my purpose. There is no purpose, because all they see are these things they can't achieve. Like most of us are just not going to have 6-pack abs. And even if we genetically could, most of us don't have the energy, time, or money to pursue it and get the trainer and eat all the right foods and do the things we're supposed to do. It's just not going to happen. And so social media, I think, is very destructive right now for what it's doing to our version of purpose.
I want to get back to some of the people who have, lost all of their worldly possessions in the fires, because when I think about legacy in particular, and I think about some of my friends who have, lost homes and collections, music studios, collections of film memorabilia, things like that, that even though, of course, they are happy that they are alive and unhurt, physically, but there is a sense of loss that is tied to this just wiping out of the reminders of your history, when I think about that. So how do you I mean, I like the bulwark of the little p purpose. Is there anything that you have learned from the bedsides of people who are dying or else in your thinking that might also help people process this loss of possessions and in the way in which they mark different elements of your life? So one more thing that I want to say is that, one of the one example is that I got married in a house in the Palisades, and now that it's gone, I can't drive by it and have that rush of memories. And so I feel like, oh no, I'm going to lose all these memories of one of the happiest days of my life, and that's now gone. Any thoughts about that?
So I have a lot of thoughts about that. First and foremost, I would never try to make light of what's happening. So anything I say now on about some things we can do does not change the fact that this is devastating. It's devastating for the people going through it. It's devastating for people like you who have memories in those places that are now damaged, changed, etc. And so I want to first say that. So no matter what I say after this, take a moment. This is a tragedy and this is devastating. Here's the thing. When we look at what causes us happiness, you can look at things, but things probably are what I call cheap thrills, right? You buy things and they make you happy for a while, and eventually you hedonically adapt and come back to a place of baseline. Buying things doesn't tend to make us happiness. Even things we own doesn't tend to make us happy. After that comes experiences. A lot of people say, don't go after things, go after experiences. But the truth of the matter is, experiences are also self-limited. They're kind of like bucket list items. You do them and then they're gone, and they're only usually present for a short period of time. I think what enduringly makes us happy is actually becoming the people we want to become. And that is only really tangentially related to the things we have or even the experience we go through. It's actually deeply rooted in being the people we want to be. So let's take this back to the dying. When I am at the bedside with dying patients and they're talking about their regrets, almost no one talks about money. No one says, I wish I made more money. No one says, I wish I worked more nights and weekends. Most people don't say, like, I wish I took that one more trip to Hawaii, even if they loved Hawaii. Most of the time, they really deeply regret the things they never had the energy, courage, or time to do. And most of those things more have to do with becoming the person they want to be than the actual thing. So for me, it was writing the book, not because I'd have a tangible book or that book could get destroyed. It was because I wanted to be the person who became the author. I wanted to be the person who did the activities. And so we come back to this idea that purpose is a bulwark. Things will come and go in your life, and unfortunately, that's somewhat uncontrollable. But being the person you want to be is ultimately what will light you up. Purpose is not about your past, and it's not about your thoughts. Purpose is about your present and future, and it's about activities. And so no one can take that away from you. They can take away your things, and your house can be destroyed, etc. But you get the choice of how you walk in the present and future, and whether you do things that light you up. And most importantly, when we look at the most enduring studies about happiness, so there are tons of studies about money and happiness, and there's some question about whether making a certain amount of money makes you happy, but once you get past that, it doesn't. Most of the studies actually aren't amazingly high quality studies. There is one really great high quality study that looks at what causes people to be happy, and it's called the Harvard Adult Developmental Health Study. And they started, I think, back in the 1930s, and they took a bunch of Harvard students and interviewed them every 2 years. Then they brought in a bunch of their family members. It was eventually 1,000 people. And then they started bringing in people from the greater Boston area. They interviewed these people every 2 years. As technology got better, they started doing blood tests, MRIs, EEGs. They looked at all sorts of data. And after 80 years, they asked what makes people happy. And they found that it wasn't money. It wasn't your job. It wasn't achievements. It wasn't even purpose. And we'll talk about that in a minute. It was interpersonal connections. If you are struggling and you lost everything, none of this takes away your ability to connect with other people, bond with other people, and that's probably what's most associated with happiness. So what does this have to do with Little P Purpose? I think Little P Purpose is a great conduit to forming interpersonal connections. And so when you do things that light you up, like a moth to a flame, other people are attracted to you and they want to collaborate. If they have something to teach you something, they want to become your teacher. If they have something to learn from you, they want to become your student. And so for everyone suffering right now, even though it feels very difficult to connect to this idea, you are still essentially the same person. You have the same passions, skills, joys, and hopefully still a lot of the same connections in the world. If you pursue your Little P purpose, if you do things that light you up, it will connect you to other people. And that's probably your best conduit to happiness. In the midst of all this going on, look at the people who are helping. Look at the people who are using their gifts to improve things. I think that's where you find the happiness. And so again, I would never make life light of this tragedy or what people are going through, because certainly I am not at the moment. But that's why I think purpose is that bulwark that we have to come back to start rebuilding, reconnecting, getting those interpersonal connections, and doing the things that ultimately make us happy.
One of the things I really like about this framework, and actually what gives me a lot of comfort, is that I think by framing things into a Little P purpose, it makes the job of rebuilding seem less paralyzing. You know, sometimes when you think, well, like, I don't even know where to begin, so I'm just going to do nothing. It's sort of like, well, okay, I don't want to do nothing. I can't do everything, but I can do these little things that maybe then can build and help me connect and so forth. And so I hope that a lot of people who are listening and aren't sure what to do, but want to help, think about that in their frame of like, well, what is your purpose? And then how can you translate that purpose into something that is tangibly helpful?
Yeah. And it connects you to other people, because how do we survive during tragedies? We survive because of our communities and connections. And again, there's different types of communities, right? There are communities which we're part of by chance, right? Like you live in a certain area, you're part of that community. Maybe even you're born into a certain religion, you're part of that community. But then there are what's called communities of internal purpose, which are people who come together for things they're deeply excited about and light them up, right? If you're part of a fan club, or if you're part of a career which you really love. I know lots of engineers who love being engineers, so they become part of engineering society, et cetera. And so we have some control of these communities of internal purpose. We can decide where the things we love, what we feel most connected to, what lights us up. and make sure we interact with those communities, especially now during tragedy, during difficult times. This is what's going to sustain us, because the things are going to come and go. And I hate to sound flippant, but it's true. The things are going to come and go, but the relationships, the connections, the feeling part of something, those things are much more enduring and much more lasting. It can't be wiped out so easily.
You know, your example of the Engineering Society really hits home for me right now, because I'm in the first year of a 2-year term as the president for the Society of Neuroscience of Creativity. So this is a group of creativity researchers that come together, and often we are shunned by much of the other neuroscience community because we study something that isn't within sort of the traditional realm of neuroscience. And so the society was created 10 years ago to provide an opportunity for us to gather and communicate our ideas and form this sense of community, essentially. And I've been thinking about, like, well, so now it's 10 years old, like, what should be the purpose of this society? And so I wanted to ask you a little bit to talk about the purpose then of groups of people. How do you take these little p purposes that people come to, and they come together because they have a common interest? And I was thinking about those kids in Centuries Antiques who were coming together and trading baseball cards, and sort of how that became much more than just trading baseball cards. It became a place for them where they were ostracized from other parts of their life to find each other. And so I wonder, in the role of these societies, especially, look, we've got social media, we've got all these niches that are online, but often they're not as tangibly helpful. Sometimes they're hurtful, if they're just causing a lot of competition and people thinking about these big P purposes. So for people who are building communities, what advice would you give to leaders in those communities to help the community thrive and be as helpful as it possibly can be to its constituents?
So here's the thing, and I think this is the colloquial use of purpose, which is not my use of purpose. So the colloquial use of purpose is our why. And I make the argument often that actually that's not purpose at all, that's meaning. So why is much more about our cognitive thoughts of our past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And when we're talking about communities, when you start saying, what's the purpose of community? What you're really saying is, what are the shared stories about this community that we're going to tell ourselves about our past to define why we're here and what we do? I think that's a very complicated question. Purpose is much more abundant and much more easy. Purpose is about the present future. It's not about thoughts. Meaning is about thoughts, and it's about our past. Purpose is about our present future, and it's about actions. And so we're talking about these communities of internal purpose. We're actually talking about these communities that come together to do things that light them up, whether that's studying neuroscientists, whether that's building things like Habitat for Humanity, whatever that is. It's a very action oriented. Now, when you get into more about this idea of cohesiveness and purpose of a community, then you're really talking about meaning. And so what that's really about are the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So I could see myself talking to a community leader and saying, you really want to create a sense of meaning for this community, and you really want to work on your foundational story of who you are and what's important to you. Once you have meaning, it's very easy to move forward into purpose, right? Because really, meaning is like our reason for being here. When we're talking about people, meaning is our sense of enoughness. It's a journey to enough. This is the story I tell myself about myself. It's a heroic journey. I became enough. I got through the hard things. And so I feel enough in the present and future to then joyfully jump into activities. When I think you're talking about a bigger community, right? We're talking about, what is our why? What's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves? What is the meaning around this group, so that we then as a group can joyfully jump into the activities of doing the things we love to do? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I would think about that.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about, yes, this distinction in terms of meaning and purpose as it relates to the past versus the current, present, and action. And I think that is a very helpful distinction. That allows, I think helps people understand. A lot of organizations, they stand behind a vision and a mission, and I think that also understanding the difference between the meaning of, like, how it is that you're branding or defining yourselves on the basis of what you've accomplished or who you are, or what have you, versus what your actual actions will be, and what your purpose is another meaningful way of sort of distinguishing those
Yeah.
concepts.
And I want to be clear on this. Meaning is a journey of enoughness. When you're talking about a community, it's that story that says, this is why we're here and this is what we're going to accomplish. That's why we've come together, because this is our version of enough, of changing the world, of doing things. When it comes to individuals, it's even more so a journey of enough. And this is really important because a lot of people skip the meaning part. They have traumas, they have things that were difficult in their past. They don't tell themselves good stories about themselves. So they don't really have that heroic journey. And so they don't have this version of enoughness. And so a lot of people who are at that point feel like they could purpose their way to enough. And so a lot of times their purpose becomes big and audacious because they're trying to prove their enoughness. They don't have that great sense of meaning. Like, I was enough in the past. I overcame difficult things. I don't have to prove myself anymore. I'm already enough. And so then they go into the present and future and start taking actions. But what they're really trying to do is prove their enoughness. And this is why you have, and we see this quite often in pop culture, like the Steve Jobses and the Elon Musks, people who create these amazing things, who make tons and tons of money. But your average person sees them on TV and says, boy, do they look miserable. It's because they don't have that good sense of meaning and enough. And so they keep on trying to do things to prove they're enough. And it becomes this never ending treadmill. I call it the achievement treadmill. And it becomes very painful.
I mean, it also lines up again with fixed versus growth mindset. I mean, if you feel like you were born with a certain amount of value, or, I think of a person who has a fixed belief about intelligence, for example, like that you're just born with a certain amount and that's it. There's nothing you can do about it. I feel like that relates to this idea of enoughness, versus a person with a growth mindset who, believes that they can continue to learn new things, and they can expand their knowledge base. That seems.
And when you feel enough on the inside, you can joyfully move into those things because you're not worried about proving yourself. You're like, oh, I can grow. I can learn. I was enough in the past. I'll be enough in the present and future. And that's kind of where that, like, the anxiety goes away and the joy comes in.
So, I mean, I think some people who, especially who hit middle age, are starting to think like, well, I didn't reach up to my potential. Is that also related to this feeling of enoughness? Do you feel like that is something? Yeah, it's just another manifestation of that, lack of feeling that you're enough.
Yeah, that's a meaning problem, right? That's I wasn't enough and I've never lived up to enough. And it's fine. You can try to purpose your way there, but it doesn't tend to solve the problems. What you need to do is go back and learn to tell yourself better stories about the past. No, I wasn't a victim. I wasn't thwarted. I just had some difficulties. I was a good person in a tough or difficult or bad situation, but look how I overcame those things to be where I am today. Once you get there, purpose gets much more abundant, much more easy, much more reasonable.
Well, this has been incredibly helpful. I wonder if there are any final thoughts that you might want to share with our listeners, either related to people who are dealing with loss, or even people who might maybe, I mean, hopefully not all of us are going to lose all of our worldly possessions in a devastating event, but all of us are going to lose people we love at some point. And that has its own, sense of loss. So, and especially if the interconnections, if those interpersonal relationships are really the pathway to happiness. Any advice that can you give to people who are experiencing loss of their loved ones, and how they might be able to work through some of that grief?
Well, so this is the wonderful thing about purpose, especially little p purpose, is we lose people all the time, but there's something I like to call generational growth. And I call it the opposite of generational trauma. So a lot of us are familiar with this idea of generational trauma, right? Our parents went through something, our grandparents went through something that changes their behavior. They hand that down to the next generation and it keeps getting handed down, handed down, handed down. It's these negative things that are handed down. I love this idea of generational growth, meaning when people get involved in little p purpose, they tend to do things that light them up and it changes the people around them. And even after that person is gone, we are still changed. And so the people you love in your life, when they pursued the things that lit them up, they had an effect on you. And I can give plenty of examples in my book about people who did things that lit them up and they had profound effects on me, even many years after they were gone. The first story in the book is about Roman, the antiques dealer, who created a community of people who loved buying and selling baseball cards and trading them. He did it because he was passionate about it, but he created a space for a lot of us nerdy, geeky kids who then found a community, and that gave us confidence to move into the future. I eventually became a doctor. People probably became lawyers and CPAs. Some maybe bought and sold things like this guy Roman did. But his life had meaning. He actually died of cancer a few years after I knew him. And yet 30 years later, I'm still talking about his effect on me. And so when you're thinking about the loss, it's easy to think about all that is no longer with us. But a lot of that generational growth is still with us. The way they touched us and changed us remains. And that's part of you. And so that's not only what we value in other people, but that's what we want to leave when we leave this earth, because our bodies disappear at some point, but the goodness we put out in the world, especially by pursuing little p purpose, can remain in the people we leave behind. And that's our best hope. That's legacy and impact. It's not whether you cured cancer, it's the people you touched and how you collaborated with them and connected with them and what you taught them that they will carry on with them and pass on to further generations.
So I want to remind our listeners that Jordan Grumet's book, The Purpose Code, How to Unlock Meaning, Maximize Happiness, and Leave a Lasting Legacy, is now available at booksellers everywhere. Jordan Grumet, thank you so much for being on Inquiring Minds.
Thank you for having me.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of this show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I want to especially thank longtime listeners David Noel, Herring Cheng, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, Charles Blyle, and Dale Lemaster. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy. I'm your host, Indre Viskontas. See you next time.